I've been busy again. You see this sub? This sub is an 18-inch ported monster, and I built it, and in this video we're going to go over the build process and how surprisingly easy it was for what it is. Stick around. Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, home theater enthusiast and lover of all things tech, and I've been thinking about which new sub to get for a while now. I mean, I have an SB3000 and it's perfectly fine, but I think it's more at home in the old version of my home theater. So since I've upgraded several components, I think it's time that I did a sub upgrade as well. Now this is going to be a pretty long video, so I've put chapter markers in the description so you can skip around to the areas that interest you if you need to. Now I've reviewed some great subs in the past and some of them are great options, but it's been a while since I've had a really good DIY project, but I don't have the machinery to build a sub from scratch. So enter GSG and the Marty flat packs. Now I've heard about Marty subs for a while, but I always pictured these massive hulking things that are at home behind an acoustically transparent screen because they're so big, but that's not necessarily the case. There are actually several versions, from the full Marty, which is what I envisioned, to the smaller mini Marty and the even smaller MartyCube, which is the one I bought. Now this is the MartyCube Roundover version 2.1 with the completely flat base, which I know some of you will absolutely love. But it certainly did not look like that when I got it. I had to build it, so let's get into it. For the build, you'll need some Type Bond 3 wood glue, a scraper, glue spreader, 4 36-inch clamps and 4 24-inch clamps, 4 smaller clamps, at least 11 wood dowels, a cloth for cleaning up excess glue, a mallet, Duratex for spraying, a blade, and your favorite can of spray paint, and a hacksaw blade. The video will have 3 main parts: assembly, finishing, and installation. The pieces come in a very unassuming box that's wrapped up tightly and secured with styrofoam. Once you dig in though, you can see the panels, which are pretty much all numbered. And that's where we begin, with panels 1, 2, and 3. Having an elevated work area is a good idea because it just makes the process a lot easier, at least in the beginning. Now, since it's the glue that will be holding everything together, it's really important that you have glue on all the parts of the panels which come in contact with each other. I'm really glad I had this glue spreader because it makes the process so much smoother. Now panels 2 and 3 sit on the outside of panel 1, so they're essentially hugging panel 1. After we join the 3 panels and making sure that they're perfectly aligned, because that's really important, we start the clamping. At this point, it's also a good idea to glue and insert panel 4 because it will actually help panels 1, 2, and 3 to be straight. And of course, you glue the edges of panel 4 as well as the inserts on panels 3 and 2. After that, we have to loosen the clamps a little bit so we can actually have some room to maneuver panel 4 into the slot of panel 3 and 2 and then secure them tightly afterwards. And of course, make sure that panel 4 is inserted all the way to the end. Then it's back to clamping. And this is where that cloth comes in handy because now you'll have to start cleaning up that excess glue which spills over. These 4 panels so far make up the top, sides, and back of the sub. Once we stand the sub upright, then we can work on inserting panel 5 because it won't affect any of the panels that we've attached so far. After that, I used 2 of the shorter 24-inch clamps to help secure panel 5. Now while those dry, we can work on assembling the baffle, which are panels 12, 13, and an unnumbered O-ring. We'll need to have glue on the surface of panel 13, and feel free to get as creative as you want when applying the glue and make whatever doodle you feel like. We'll do the same thing to panel 12, but before we combine them, we'll have to put in 7 dowels into those holes so that they'll be held together firmly. And of course, we put glue in the dowel holes as well. The O-ring can be separated pretty easily by hand, and if you want, you can also remove the excess material around the edges, but that's completely optional because it won't affect anything. Then we apply some more glue to the baffle and the ring before combining them. And once that's done, we get to clamping. Now I clamp the 4 corners of the baffle, but it's also important to clamp the inside portion where the 3 pieces meet. After that, we can put it aside and let it dry so we can move on to the next portion, which is working on the base. Now what's special about the 2.1 version of the MartyCube is that the base is entirely flat and doesn't have the U-shaped brackets that used to act as the feet anymore. No, it's completely flat. So if you want to put the sub on the side, then you can do that and still have flat edges on all sides. The base has holes for 4 dowels as well, which we insert once we apply the glue to panel 10. And the panel that we combine with panel 10 doesn't actually have a number, but it looks like the number 3, so you can't really miss it. After that, we put these panels to dry as well, but since I don't have any extra clamps, I'll just leave this woofer right here. If you'll be using a Speakon connection like I will, then you'll need the Speakon adapter, which can be found in the bottom of the box. And while you're there, you may as well pull out panel number 11, which is the back of the sub. Then you can put them somewhere for the glue to dry because you won't be needing them for a while. Once all that's complete, now I think it's time to take the sub off the table because it's getting a bit too heavy for it. Now that we have it here, it's a good opportunity to do some cleanup by blowing away all the styrofoam pieces and cleaning up all the excess glue which has spilled over. Once that's complete, it's time to start on the internal bracing with panels 6 and 7. This is also where dry fitting is starting to get increasingly important. Also note the orientation of panels 6 and 7 with the numbers up top facing each other. That's really important to get right. And again, we glue liberally anywhere panels are connecting. At this point, we apply clamps to the ends of the panels we just inserted to keep them in place. And a couple on the back as well to secure the panels together. In hindsight, I should have attached a couple to the front as well, but more on that later. Then we work on inserting panels 8 and 9 in the same manner, with the numbers on the left facing each other with 8 on the bottom and 9 up top. Then we clamp those together and wait for them to dry. The sub is really starting to take shape now. While those panels dry, we can clean up the excess glue on the baffle assembly. Now is a good time to do it before the glue gets really dry and really hard. Trust me, you'll really appreciate it later. We can also cut off the portions of the dowels that protrude on the base assembly. And since we have panel 10 handy, then we might as well attach the base to the sub. Dry fitting again is very important because it helps you to see if there are any issues you'll have when you attach the pieces together. We apply glue to the left and right edges of the base and the sub. After that, we combine them, making sure the front edges are especially flush. Then we clamp and let it dry. Now we add the port braces, which serve to add extra rigidity to the structure. And because of how close the two panels that it sits between are in my build, I had a hard time actually getting the brace in there, so I had to use a mallet. And this is the part of the video where pregnant women, kids, and those squeamish may want to look away. Don't look at me. You can see me immediately starting to go to work. Improvise, adapt, overcome, right? So what happened? What caused this? I mentioned it before, but in hindsight, I think I should have put 2 clamps on the front of the sub so I could pull panels 1 and 4 just a millimeter closer to the braces 6 and 7. That would have given me more space between panels 4 and 10. But you know what they say about hindsight? It never calls you back until it's too late. Just so I'm clear, this was entirely my fault, because if I was paying attention to the other edge of the panel I was putting in and the dadu that it actually fit in between, then I would have seen that it didn't line up and the problem could have been avoided, like I did with the other one. But I'm hoping you can learn from my error and not make the same mistake. There are other people who have built their subs without breaking critical pieces of it, like Giles, for example, from Home Theater Fanatics, and I've linked his video in the description. As any avid DIYer knows, mistakes and mishaps happen, but what's important is how you deal with them. Now in this case, there's a whole Facebook group of people who have built and who are interested in building MartySub, so if you have any issues, then you can check them out and ask questions there. I've linked that in the description as well. The guys over at GSG are really helpful as well, and I have to thank Kevin for all of the advice and tips he gave me even before I started building. That's how the first one should have gone. Now we work on attaching the side port brace, which goes much smoother. There's one on the left and right side. After that, we clamp the parts which are at the front, and then we can move on to some painting. Before the sub is fully assembled, you have to paint the port because it would be really difficult to access once the sub is fully assembled. So we use painter's tape on the parts which will have glue in the future, leaving only the parts that we want to paint exposed. The first person I saw with a colored port was Brian from Woody Sound Up, and I thought it was a great idea. The color contrast on the black sub adds a bit of visual interest, a flare even, but I don't think it has a name, so I think I'll dub it the Marty Flare. Let me know in the comments what you think. Next step is to attach the baffle, and in the time it took for the paint to dry, we lost the sunlight, so now we're inside the garage. To attach the baffle, we apply glue to the dadus as well as the inside and outside edges. After that, we really clamp it down and wait for it to dry. I also painted the back of panel 11, the rear, as well, and now it's time to install it. We apply glue to the dados as well as the inside and outside edges, as well as the edges of the sub and port braces. Then we look at the finish line approaching from the distance and then add some clamps. Next is one of those really important detail steps and the thing that gives the sub its name, the roundover baffle. Now on the front where you'll be attaching the baffle, it's really important to make sure that it's completely flat, meaning there are no protruding glue beads or anything. It should be completely flush. Then it's important to dry fit the baffle to make sure that it aligns perfectly with the sub. Now this is where you use your fingers to go around the edges to make sure that you align it perfectly and make sure that there are no overhanging edges, whether on the top, left, right, or the bottom. If there is, then that will be something you'll have to sand down in the future and plan accordingly on how you'll rectify it. If you follow the instructions and build your sub perfectly, then you shouldn't have any issues when you get to this step. Once you verify that everything lines up correctly, then you can apply some glue to the baffle and to the sub. Clamping here is really delicate work because you have to make sure that you don't create any overhangs and that all the edges remain flush as they should be. So take your time and make sure that you get this step correct because it's one of the most important steps. After that's done, make sure to clamp the bottoms, the tops, the middles, basically everywhere you can. Then go have a drink and wait till morning. You've earned it. After a night of dreaming of styrofoam sculptures and permanently glued fingers, we can check out how the glue has dried on our sub. And every dollop of glue we see here has to be cleaned off before we can paint the sub because it would not look good painted. As someone who makes videos on YouTube, I get perks that the average person doesn't. For example, I have another package here, and instead of having to go through the build process again, I can just do this. Once we clean up all the excess glue, then we apply some spackle to the edges to fill in all the gaps and crevices. It doesn't really matter how much you apply really, all that matters is that you cover all the creases. And that's because most of it will be sanded off. I used an orbital sander with 400 grit sandpaper, which resulted in a very smooth finish. You don't really need an orbital sander, you could use sandpaper or a sanding sponge, but I used this because it made it so much easier. The aim is to sand it until it's smooth to the touch, where you can't feel any seams. Also, make sure to wear a mask because MDF dust and lungs have had a historically bad relationship. This is how it looks after I finish sanding, and as you can tell, most of the spackling is gone. After prepping the sub, it was time for some spraying, and I'm using spray-on Duratex, which is different from the roll-on Duratex. It comes pretty thick, so you'll have to thin it out if you want to use it with a sprayer. The mixture consisted of about 30% of the finest bottled water. I'm just kidding. Or am I? Now, I've only seen people use hopper guns and HVLP sprayers, which is high velocity, low pressure sprayers, but I have a high efficiency airless sprayer and I really didn't want to have to go and get another kind, so I used that instead and it worked perfectly. After the first coat, I could see all the dollops of glue that I missed during my sanding, so I'll have to sand them down again if I want a smooth finish, which I'll do after the second coat. I used a 100 grit sandpaper handheld to really dig in there and get out all the glue, which I then used a 400 grit sandpaper on to smooth it out. I think the 100 grit was a bit too abrasive, so 200 grit may have been a better choice, but I made it work. After I finished sanding, it really looks like a rustic design sub, which I really dig, but alas, it was not meant to be. After 2 more coats of paint, it was time to let it dry for a few hours so you could start with the woofer installation. So for the installation, we'll need 2 speak-on connector chassis mount, a 10-331 female disconnect, 50 feet of 12 gauge wire for both subs, a wire stripper, the screws to secure the sub, some cable sleeve tubes, 2 speak-on cable amp connectors, gasking tape, a heat source, in this case a lighter, and a drill. Now the first thing we'll make is the internal wiring to connect the driver to the speak-on connector on the back of the sub, and for this we need about 4 feet of wiring. If when we're done we see that that's too long, then we can always cut it shorter. We attach the female disconnects to the wires and crimp them down so they're secure, and that's so we can attach the wire to the speak-on connector easily. And these cable sleeves are kind of like the opposite of those franks that plump when you cook them. They actually shrink. This adds an extra bit of protection and helps the aesthetic. It also helps prevent the leads from touching at any point. We then apply the red wire to the 1 positive and the black wire to the 1 negative leads. After that, we insert the wire through the hole in the back of the sub and use the M5 by 30mm screw to secure the speak-on connector. When dealing with MDF, it's better to drill pilot holes first so that when you insert the screws, it doesn't split. Now we're in the home stretch. It's time to lay the gasking tape on the baffle of the woofer so that when we install the driver, it's airtight. This Dayton driver has an aluminum cone and a single 4 ohm voice coil, so it has a single pair of connection terminals. Since this driver is so big and unwieldy, we use zip ties through the screw holes so we can better maneuver it to insert it into the cabinet. Once it's inserted, we can make some final adjustments to make sure that the spacing around the entire sub is even. Then we drill some more pilot holes for the screws surrounding the sub and then take our final step. These are cap head screws, by the way, which gives it a very professional look. And done. The sub ends up being 28 inches tall, 23.5 inches deep, and 24 inches wide, almost like a cube, hence the name. It's also being powered by a Behringer NX6000 rack-mounted amp with a mini DSP 2x4 HD and uses a Dayton Audio RSS460-HO 18-inch driver. It has a 19Hz port tune and weighs more than I care to find out. So now I have the subs set up in my home theater. I have measured and calibrated them with Rue, as well as calibrating them with my AVR. And can I just say that these subs are absolute monsters. Not only do they have a really imposing presence and look really good, mind you, but they have a ridiculous amount of output. Now, big subs like this isn't necessarily about the quantity of bass, it's about the quality of the bass that they produce. The first movie I watched with these subs was Fury, and if you've seen that movie, then you know it is really intense. And after I finished watching the movie, I had pictures and paintings on my wall that were now crooked. I could really feel the bass, more so than any subwoofer I've tested, but that's also not that surprising since these are also the biggest subs I've ever had in this room. But they did all that without barely breaking a sweat. I have the subs paired with a Behringer NX 6000 rack mounted amp, not the 6000D version which has the built-in DSP. This version doesn't have the DSP because I also got a mini DSP 2x4 HD which I used to act as a DSP for the sub. Let me know in the comments if you want to see a video of how I use the mini DSP to tune the subs to my room and how I used it to implement my house curve. One of the big drawbacks of having a rack mounted amp like this Behringer is that they're not necessarily meant for a home setting, so they don't have convenience features like a 12-volt trigger which would then turn the amp on when your receiver or processor turns on. But there are workarounds for that, like this power strip I got which works extremely well, and I've left links to that and everything I used in my build in the description. The gray Marty flare I put on my sub looks really good in my room, but if for example these fluences that I'm reviewing with their white cones was my permanent speaker, then I think I'd put in a white Marty flare, which I think would look really good and make a really good combo. But that said, I think my Orendo speakers and the Dayton driver in the sub make an absolutely beautiful combo. More so than the UM18, which is the other popular driver for a Marty sub build. But yeah, let me know what you think about the video and my new setup in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video if you liked it and subscribe if you haven't. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood Villaman saying be safe and peace.